for three critical reasons. The first is the constitutional obligation that we have to follow the principle of friendship to all, malice to none, which is embedded in the constitution. Henceforth, that actually provides us a ground to see the bilateral relations and multilateral relations through balanced prism. And the second issue is Bangladesh's economic growth, so which has largely been between 7 to 8% over the past 2-3 years, and perhaps over 5% during the past 20 years. Now, perhaps we have 170 million people over here who needs to be fed, who needs to have access to job, who needs to have access to consumption. So therefore, for us, market plays much more important role than the security or perhaps the foreign policy of geopolitics here. And the third reason that we see a much more difficulties in maneuvering between India and China, for obvious reason. In one hand, as India remains as a historic friend since the liberation of 1971, and subsequently this has been one of the closest neighbor and having the largest border with Bangladesh. On the other hand, China has become a very critical actor in the development process as well as the economic process. So therefore, for us, this relationship is extremely important that the China-India relationship goes to some sort of acceptably neutral level. Now, what happens in the case of international security environment? Obviously, when we look into the Ladakh crisis at the moment, has created some sort of, opened some sort of Pandora's box. And perhaps at the simultaneous time, we have seen that the Nepal has claimed its new territory and has enacted its new map. On the other hand, there are pending issues related to Ladakh, which is line of actual control, which is long been not appreciated by Beijing by saying that they don't really adhere to the McMahon line principle. And perhaps Zhou Enlai and Jawaharlal Nehru, when they met back in late 50s, essentially Zhou Enlai clearly reiterated the position of China by saying that we don't actually ratify this particular British colonial border lining. So he mentioned the term British colonial line. So that also shows that there is a disgruntled attitude toward the colonial mapping that has been endorsed and ratified by the countries such as Bangladesh, Myanmar, and obviously Pakistan. Now, that also comes at a moment when the China-Pakistan economic corridor was initiated. And that corridor goes through Kashmir and essentially is in the closest proximity of the Kashmir border. And perhaps that is another main concern for Delhi as well as Islamabad, where of course the biggest beneficiary still remains as Beijing. And Beijing has seen that this is a greater opportunity for them to exercise their strategic and economic growth. Perhaps Pakistan's economic growth has largely been stagnated, if not gone to a reverse order. But perhaps one of the factors that Pakistan has largely been able to do is pull strings in the international atmosphere. And perhaps it is highly connected to Washington politics, it is connected to Brussels politics, and perhaps it is now integrated, almost integrated with Beijing politics. And perhaps this is one of the fundamental flag bearer of Chinese Middle Kingdom syndrome, which we call, which is essentially known as the Belt and Road Initiative. And with that particular thing, obviously, Beijing has always seen CPEC as a strategic corridor for obvious reason is to access to the Indian Ocean and subsequently stretching their muscles all the way up to the Arab Sea. Now, what happens is that Gadar has cut its influence. I mean, its reliance on the Strait of Malacca and subsequently the downstreams. For obvious reason, that Gadar is now providing an easier and efficient access for the Chinese goods to come all the way to China through CPEC. And perhaps that has also created another uneasy situation for the Southeast Asian countries, because particularly if you take Singapore and beyond, they have largely seen that the heavy mobility of transport of the Chinese goods has largely been economically beneficial. So Chinese have another issue that they are now embarking on, which is the anti-Indo-Pacific strategy. And Indo-Pacific strategy, which is also which also takes the Quad dialogue, quadrilateral dialogue between India, Japan, Australia, and United States. And perhaps they have always seen that this Quad is another geostrategic strings, or what you call that geostrategic quadrilateral response to Chinese presence in the South China Sea. So therefore, they have created an alternative defense line in case if there is certainly an obstacle in the transport mobility and the defense mobility in the South China Sea and downstream. So perhaps this is the reason why Pakistan will continue to be the fundamental feature in Beijing politics as well as in the Washington politics. Now, even if you take the case of the Pakistan-Myanmar relationship at the moment, which is again thriving at a parallel speed that the India-Myanmar relationship. Now, we have always seen that the Burmese generals are pretty much close to Beijing, and perhaps one of the fundamental actors in the Burmese development has always been the Chinese. But one thing we have to understand that Myanmar presents a very hybrid situation, where you have a very unique kind of political system where 25% of the parliamentary seats are reserved for Tatmadaw, which is their armed forces. And if you have 25% seats reserved for the armed forces, and then the three critical ministries, the Foreign, Home Affairs, and Borders, are dominated by the Tatmadaw generals. So by default, through the constitutional requirement, the generals are the ministers for the home, foreign, and the border. And given that situation, obviously the Chinese has never seen Myanmar as a democratic state, and perhaps the generals are much more comfortable with the non-democratic regimes in Beijing. So historically, the miscalculation, which we often call as geostrategic miscalculation in the part of Delhi, is that ideologically, these two entities will always remain closer. And perhaps the generals are at the moment definitely having a closer relationship with Delhi in case of military, in case of Kaladan project, in case of Sitwe. But on the other hand, the problem lies in the economic mismatch between Beijing and Delhi, and of course Beijing and Washington at the moment, because Washington historically has stopped providing grants and development and financing the militaries in the non-democratic countries long back. So therefore there is a vacuum where the US and the Western allies are essentially not focusing much because of their legal and policy constraints. So that's, this has become the battleground, or perhaps a sweet spot for both India and China to embark on strategic competition. The problem is then again, if you see that the Chinese have provided military support, on the other hand, India has sent military support to Myanmar. And with that, even in last December, India has gifted almost a Kilo-class Russian-built submarine to the military juntas. The problem lies with the countries like Bangladesh. Now, Bangladesh has a historically very lukewarm relationship with Myanmar. And on the other hand, Bangladesh has a military engagement, perhaps through the Memorandum of Understanding for Defense Cooperation in 2017, that the countries will be cooperating in the case of strategic crises. Now, after August 2017, the strategic crisis between Bangladesh and Myanmar escalated to a huge extent, and we are now having 1.1 million refugees coming to Bangladesh from Rakhine in August 2017, which has largely been considered by United Nations as well as the European countries as a national security crisis for Bangladesh. And when you have 1.1 million people as foreigners living in the country, suddenly there are the potentials for radicalization, extremism, and many other things. And perhaps sustaining 1.1 million foreigners in the land which is already the highest density of population in the world, has become another menace. And given that situation, Bangladesh has found itself in an awkward position when they saw that post 2017, the military cooperation between Myanmar and Bangladesh has risen. And on the other hand, India remains largely absent or abstained from the votings against Myanmar atrocities in the United Nations. And perhaps that has created some sort of ambiguity in Dhaka in understanding that which way should we go. And if this is the security crisis and national security crisis, and we still see that the neighboring countries are abstaining from supporting us, eventually creates a hollow in the foreign policy. So henceforth, the Chinese essentially came in the month of September 2017 as a clever response, and they stepped in by saying we will be doing the mediation. And subsequently, in the same month, when Mr. Modi went to Naypyidaw and said that the Rohingya issue is a critical security threat to Myanmar, not Bangladesh. So that creates a big wake-up call in Dhaka by saying that this is perhaps we are in the crossroad between Beijing and Delhi. So Beijing came, foreign minister came and offered a very interesting solutions to us, and by saying that we will go to Naypyidaw and start working on it. And perhaps he met the prime minister, went to Delhi, went to Naypyidaw, and offered a solution which is practically non-executable. And at least that was one time when Xi Jinping and company came and provided at least some sort of verbal assurance, whereas the neighboring countries, starting from all the way to Islamabad, to Delhi, to Kathmandu, to Colombo, remained largely silent. So in that situation, obviously the Chinese created an atmosphere to make Bangladesh and the Burmese generals to sit together. And that was done, and the repatriation agreement was signed, knowing that the Burmese may perhaps not be very cordial in implementing that. So that signature, after that signature, Wang Yi actually proposed the new China-Myanmar economic corridor. And that's where the prelude comes, because he essentially mentioned in his speech that Beijing wants to create a Y road which will connect Arakan and other Rakhine and others with Mandalay and others. Now, perhaps that Y road is a prelude to China-Myanmar economic corridor, and we immediately picked it up by saying that, well, this is a China-Myanmar economic corridor coming. There is a China-Pakistan economic corridor going on, and perhaps the Nepal's closer tie with Beijing has created another geopolitics to unfold. And the Ladakh crisis was not an unexpected crisis for us. So we had actually been discussed in Dhaka many times that if there is the Chinese interest in the regions like Ladakh and Sikkim, what will be our role? And perhaps that is another grave crisis that we have. So again, when we looked into the China-India relationship, we looked into the Xi Jinping's 2016-2017 14 points. If you remember that, which is now considered as Xi Jinping's 14 points, has highlighted 4 very critical features. One is obviously, he has mentioned that party supremacy over the PLA. which means that PLA was essentially been not at par with the Communist Party's agenda. And probably the modernization that China was looking forward to was not being delivered by PLA. So that actually came as a critical feature. And obviously that also gives you an indication that perhaps Xi Jinping wants to reiterate his position over the armed forces and perhaps his political agenda of having unified or one China policy and having a military supremacy has to be established, and that was a clear indication over there. And then he talked about the national unity, which we also looked into. And if you look at Taiwan, if you look at Tibet, and all these issues are essentially in contradiction with the democratic aspiration that Delhi presents. So, and henceforth, the mismatch between the democracy and non-democratic approaches to foreign policy was heavily contested over here. And perhaps this national unity will become a major unfold or major flashpoint for the global politics that we wrote back in 2018. And perhaps now what we are seeing in Hong Kong, what we are seeing in Taiwan, and obviously what we are now seeing in South China Sea gives us a clear indication that the 14 points is going through the direction that was envisaged by Xi Jinping. And obviously he has also talked about shared value and new international relations. And when he talked about new international relations, obviously he talked about Asian Infrastructure Bank, and he has created Contingency Bank, and even many of their MOFCOM initiatives have been transferred or has been created or reformed as similar to USAID, which is the Chinacom or something like that. So they're now also going for a widespread engagement, not only in terms of the trade and investment, perhaps through the development projects and AIIB, in which India was a part. And perhaps that was one of the very important indicator for Bangladesh to have faith on AIIB. And even if you look at the party supremacy agenda of Xi Jinping, also shows you that there is a greater interest in the part of Beijing to initiate reforms. And perhaps what we are now seeing in Colombo, and this is a classic example where the debt trap issue was highlighted repeatedly. We learned from it quite well. And perhaps if you look at the BRI agreement that we had with Xi Jinping back in October 2016, has talked about soft grants and the projects almost like $40 to $50 billion. But many of the projects actually didn't materialize, and there were no compulsion in doing so. Because first of all, we clearly realized that debt trap is an important factor in many of the foreign policy imperatives, whether it is China or Washington or the multilaterals. But of course, this will largely depend on the political vision. And perhaps if we go and replicate projects like Hambantota and others, probably we will not be in a very suitable situation. And perhaps the infrastructural investment that we are creating is largely on the basis of commercial loan and perhaps with the support of the multilaterals too. So what investment that we talk about over here in FDI and obviously in market is slightly different than the infrastructure for which we are now paying our own money or the multilateral money. But the problem lies, as usual, the corruption. And the corruption perhaps has become another major factor in Bangladesh politics. Even if you follow Bangladesh's last 6 months of politics, or perhaps the last 15 days of politics, even the health sector, we are now global champion in providing fake COVID certification. And with that situation, obviously the political governance over here remains largely loose. And that is exactly the fear. But on the other hand, the good part is that none of the what we call white elephant sort of projects were actually initiated, or neither China has ever compelled us to undertake those projects. The problem lies, again, is the market creation. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, 170 million people, For the Prime Minister, obviously, now we de facto we have a one-party rule, and Prime Minister's major agenda is to reduce any kind of public grievances or public disobedience, and for which she needs to really deliver governance, which is largely missing. But on the other hand, the employment and economic growth will be largely hit by by the COVID, and obviously the 8% growth will come down to 2 to 3% eventually for the next 2-3 years. And the question remains that how the economy of 170 million will sustain without massive investment coming from abroad. And even if you look at the Bangladesh offered two special economic zones, one to China, the other one to India. And India recently came up and said that they are no longer interested in investing it on the basis of feasibility studies. Now, that was another deep crisis for Bangladesh by saying that if the investments are being discouraged, therefore the post-COVID situation will be difficult. Now, obviously, this will be a sweeter opportunity for the Chinese or even the Koreans to come and invest in the same project. So that's where we will see that more Chinese project will eventually come. Even if you look at the involvement of Japan in the development infrastructure or perhaps development process is as strong as what you see in the case of the Chinese and the multilateral institutions. Now we are building the deep sea port, which is funded by the government and partially by the Japanese International Cooperation Agency, JICA. And even by India's investment in the power plant and the dredging and obviously in the road infrastructure is also pretty much high. And in fact, from day before yesterday, now that Indian products can go through the Chittagong port to all the way to Northeast India using Bangladesh's port and surface infrastructure. So essentially that provision has always been there, and that has been essentially been materialized very recently. So we can also see that there is a greater effort in the case of the government to create some sort of balanced relationship between India and China. And obviously, Bangladesh has to be pretty careful in the case of the looming gap between Indo-Pacific and the BRI initiatives. Now, even if you look at the recent vaccine politics, I mean, again, I'm going back to my own weakness of corruption, for which we haven't invested essentially any money in the vaccine programs, whether it is in Oxford or China or any other places where the Indians have essentially invested heavily in the Oxford vaccine program. Now, that's the time when the deliberate reason of mentioning the fake COVID certification is to tell you that why the Chinese essentially will come and have a better access, because they will now be providing us back vaccine, provided we give them the space to experiment or they go for the fourth trial of Sinovac vaccine, which is again not an issue that a deliberate way of asking them to come and do that. Perhaps this is again a governance failure when you have essentially a very one party sort of government in the country. On the other hand, if you look at the Bay of Bengal, which is a very important factor for both Indian strategic autonomy, and perhaps the Chinese are much more strengthening their links in the Bay of Bengal. And we have purchased 2 submarines from China at the wake of the conflict between Bangladesh and Myanmar. And we were in the verge of war in 2007. We were in the verge of conflict in 2013. And perhaps that has compelled us to go for the greater exercise of strategic autonomy of the water, which was delimited through ITLAWs and UNCLAWs. And we have now legally resolved the maritime border issues with India and Myanmar. And perhaps one of the greater argument for Bangladesh in buying submarines and modernizing the naval force was premeditated thinking that the regular encroachment of Myanmar Navy and perhaps the escalating tensions between Myanmar and Bangladesh. So therefore, this was one of the responses, and perhaps it was actually buying the submarine and others were actually being reiterated in our defense policies back in 2001, 2, 3, 4. And it was finally materialized after this current regime came in 2010 and 14. It was finalized and 16 it was delivered. 17 it was delivered. So what we have acquired over the period of time is a geopolitical tension and the geostrategic tension, where by default China has become a critical actor. Now the question lies is how do we further balance, and given if Delhi doesn't really reform its foreign policy towards Bangladesh, and perhaps what we often tell that probably we are the last cohort of India standing firm with India at the moment. And perhaps if India keeps seeing Bangladesh through the prism of China, will essentially be another miscalculation for the political parties over here and certainly political parties in Delhi. And obviously, we have looked into another major problem, which is affecting a large electorate. And perhaps here I may label them as Muslim electorate, perhaps, because we have almost like 81, 82% of population who are Muslim. So therefore, the CAA and NRC remains as a massive political rhetoric over here. Although India has assured repeatedly that this is perhaps an internal problem of India, an internal issue of India, but the law labels Bangladesh as a country which has been repressing the minorities, and perhaps it has been repressing the non-Islamic entities over here, which has largely been contested by Delhi itself, and particularly the current relationship between the current government and Delhi has never been this best in its history. And having a faith on a government like this and having a secular government like this, perhaps when it is seen as an Islamic, pro-Islamic state, perhaps doesn't give a really good vibe to the secular political parties like the current government. And obviously we had two elections into 2014 and 2018, which has largely been contested by the international community by saying that the elections were flawed. But interestingly, there are only two countries which actually proactively came and supported the election. And irony is India and China. And perhaps this government has become favorite for both. Now, the awkward situation for Delhi is that they have invested all their eggs in one basket. But on the other hand, for Beijing, they have invested their eggs in different baskets. So therefore, they have a much more greater smooth access to investment and offer a number of impetus to the government, which Delhi has largely been in the limited scale. And obviously, we have received a bilateral credit line. $2 billion has been materialized out of $10 billion, but the Chinese credit line is almost like $30 billion. So what remains as a critical factor for us is if the CMAC is being developed, if CPAC is in absolute full swing, then what would be Bangladesh's role in the regional politics? Or perhaps if it becomes overtly pro-Delhi, it doesn't really deliver to a great extent to the economic need, which is the prime importance for the government in order to resist itself from inflation, from unemployment, and from initiating large-scale infrastructure projects. So that is a critical challenge. On the other hand, if it becomes too close to Beijing, then the problem lies with the Indo-Pacific alliance, or perhaps Indo-Pacific cohorts, in which the Washington sees Bangladesh through the prism of Delhi often. So here, the critical foreign policy concern, not only for Bangladesh, but also for India to understand how Bangladesh has to be placed in this whole greater geopolitical game. And even if you look at the offers which was given by the Indian private sector, Sahara Group in 2010 to build new cities has never been materialized because unfortunately Mr. Subrata Bose had to go behind the bar. But on the other hand, the Chinese offered two cities and they have initiated the work for the two cities already. And that came through a competitive bidding. And perhaps one of the critical agenda for Delhi was always by saying that the Dhaka Stock Exchange, which has known as a very notorious stock exchange, having two major crises in 1997, 98, and obviously in 2010 and 11, has been 25% of the stock market has been purchased by the Chinese Shanghai Stock Exchange, where the National Stock Exchange of India had to be. But perhaps it was under the procurement law, which allows the highest bidder. And perhaps the Chinese were the highest bidder over here. And unfortunately, the Indian bidding was much more smaller or limited in terms of offer. So that also shows you that it is not only that the Chinese are interested in infrastructure or perhaps the economic investment, but also in the process of capital integration in future. So that has always been raised by Bangladesh in a number of platforms, because we cannot change the procurement law and therefore they have won. But on the other hand, this also shows the future ambition of Chinese government in the region. And perhaps if you look at the Karachi stock exchanges, Islamabad and other places, or even in the Colombo Stock Exchange, they still have very strong presence. And it is not that the issue of the China-India will dominate Bangladesh's political discourse, but also the issue of the relationship with Pakistan. And recently there was a talk between the Pakistani envoy and the foreign minister, who actually came for a courtesy call-on. I mean, courtesy call-on in a sense, it is his first call-on as the new High Commissioner to Dhaka, came and obviously he joined the foreign minister's meeting. Has largely been highlighted by the Indian media, saying that this was an attempt for rebuilding the relationship between Pakistan and Bangladesh. But however, the relationship with Pakistan will definitely grow, but that growth will not be an extent where it can be replicated and considered as a model relationship. So essentially, Bangladesh has always pursued a multilateralism, and multilateralism will continue to make Bangladesh much more effectively engaged with the neighboring countries. And even if you look at the case of Indian media recently reacted quite strongly on the grants that they're on the duty-free, quota-free that we have received, but perhaps forgot that this duty-free, quota-free discussion was on since 2016, and then it was discussed in 14th Joint Commission between Beijing and Dhaka in 2017 and 2018, and perhaps it was a continuation. And perhaps the COVID time is being linked, but if you look at the documents, it was on the offing for a long, long time. So, and perhaps this is the same time when we are also receiving similar sort of benefits from US and the European Union. And perhaps that's the part of the news which has not been highlighted in many of the political discourses that we find quite uncomforting sometimes. So overall, a situation that Bangladesh's aspiration to become a relatively neutral, and of course to provide as much as support to the neighboring countries will continue to grow. And this is a harsh reality, geopolitical reality, and perhaps the governance issues. Everything has a compound effect. And perhaps this is where we think that Delhi may want to reconsider Bangladesh's views on Bangladesh and the political system, and perhaps its relationship with Myanmar and others may continuously put a pressure on us in terms of the Rohingya refugee and other things. And finally, the final word, and perhaps in the case of Sino-Indian relationship, we have seen that the trade relationship between China and India has continued to grow, and which has gone almost to $95 billion, in which the trade deficit is a major concern for India. But that also shows that the market actually plays a critical role over here. I often make this joke that if you want to really buy a solid European grade product, then probably our consumption capacity or the purchase capacity is not at par with the European products. And perhaps this is exactly where the Chinese, with their solid manufacturing and cheaper good, comes to everyone and offers these products. And this is a pure market economy. And perhaps the consumption economy that dominates a greater extent of Chinese influence in the countries such as Bangladesh and Nepal, and to a great extent India. And over the period of time, even if you take Bangladesh example, if you take Nepal, Sri Lankan example, you would always see that much more economic goodies in terms of cheaper goodies, or whether the Chinese AC will work for 5 years or not, but perhaps we cannot buy consumer goods. They sent to the European markets because of the price, and the price determines. And perhaps another issue of the energy cooperation between nuclear energy cooperation between United States and India will always be a critical concern for Beijing. And obviously now that India has logistics agreements with United States, is considered as a future threat for Beijing. And this is exactly how the politics in Bangladesh is unfolding. So perhaps only perhaps the foreign policy determinants in future for Bangladesh will still remain the market, and who exploits the market, and what kind of market mechanisms are being offered by the international community will determine Bangladesh's strategic future. Thank you very much for your kind patience, kind hearing.
It was great to hear to you, Dr. Shahab, and the sharp reaction that the Indian media raised was not merely because of the free quota issue. What was happening back in India was that we are a totally import dependent edible oil economy, and this edible oil started to got route through Bangladesh through the free mode, which was a bit of a problem, and that's how the sharp criticism came in. I believe that a free market economy is there to come and rule, and your points are taken.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's one of the part of the whole gamut of discourse that we have seen. And perhaps another issues like the border and water also dominates the discourse over here very strongly.
I think between India and Bangladesh, there is a small little issue of the border, but it has already been resolved to a very large extent. And water is also an issue which has been persisting for last 4 decades, 5 decades, and I think it's also on the verge of getting largely resolved.
I think because I sit in this particular dialogue, the problem is the water issue. We have already talked about one, the Ganges, but the Ganges is one of the 52 rivers. So Tista is in there, Brahmaputra and everything is in there. So there is no solutions at our site that it is coming anytime soon.
Yeah.
So that's a problem. And in the case of border, the demarcation has been done. The swap of the land boundary, swap of the enclaves are done. Land boundary agreement has been ratified by India in 2016, I assume. I forgot the exact year, but it was Bangladesh ratified it in 1974. Now, what happens is the border killing remains as a major problem. Now, there is a blame game going on at the moment, but at the end of the day, the people who are killed are essentially Bangladeshis. So this is exactly the issue that has been highlighted in the border guard and border security forces meetings. And there has been regular joint statement coming from both the sides by saying that it has to go slow. But the number continues. So these are probably, this is the reason Guardian and other newspapers have essentially seen Bangladesh-India border as the most violent border in the world after the Israel-Palestine border. So these are the issues that has created a very strong public opinion, and this has a very strong implication on the electorate. So maybe even if you look at the onion crisis that has happened, of course, India's internal issues are very important. National interest is important. That's the reason the Prime Minister had to come up and literally give a statement by saying that at least they could have informed us earlier so that we could have managed our onion coming from other countries. Because the problem is when you have a one-party government, they have to look into the every kind of discontent coming, whether legitimately coming or illegitimately coming, or perhaps rationally coming or irrationally coming. So I agree with you that there are a number of indicators, number of factors that determines all these decisions. But perhaps there is also a problem, that's why we have raised it many times, that what kind of political governance we have. And Delhi remains pretty much happy, as I mentioned earlier, that Delhi has invested all its eggs in one basket. But there are others who have invested in many other baskets. So that's the reason, perhaps, the having such a political governance regime, it is very difficult for them to really make a balance in these cases. Because if they go out to the public and say that no, this is an Indian problem and this, and probably people are going to react. And these are the hardcore realities of the subcontinental politics of populism and subcontinental politics of ultra-nationalism, or even if you say that the politics of religion and electorate. So I often refer to it as the politics of number. And of course, we love our growth rates by saying that this is 8%. But if you look at the divide, the economic divide in Bangladesh, I mean, the difference between the rich and poor, and if you look at the almost diminishing middle class, I might have 8% growth, but that growth does not really trickle down to the bottom. That's a problem. We have provided some sort of basic uplifting to the livelihood, but that does not significantly reduces the gap between the poor and the rich. Now, that is another source of serious discontent. And when you have serious discontent, obviously any kind of bilateral mechanism also affects. Now, water, for example, is the core, because this is the country that is heavily dependent on water. And Bangladesh is a lower riparian. I mean, Bangladesh's topographical composition, economic composition is largely based on water and agriculture. So every time this flood, every time the water is not being dealt with properly, and in fact, in 2019, October, when Prime Minister was in Delhi, we signed an agreement with MOU with Delhi to provide Feni water, which is Feni is in Bangladesh, Feni water to Tripura. Instead of receiving water or resolving the problem, the Prime Minister, in a goodwill gesture, has said, of course, Tripura needs water, and there we have some abundance of water, and they can use it. And perhaps the argument was that in any case, that water was being diverted to Tripura. We have just formalized it by saying that this is okay. So these are the ways we see, and perhaps even if you look at this 1.1 million people, and one of the largest argument for the foreign policy establishment or the political establishment to allow this 1.1 billion people from Rakhine to come is the lesson from 1971. And perhaps in 1971, we had a large number of refugees who went to India to seek refuge from the brutality of the Pakistan army. And that's the reason the Prime Minister and even people like us came out and said, look, we have to provide them because we understand how it felt back in 1971 to be a refugee. And that's exactly, and we recognize that particular support. And even if you look at the Prime Minister since 2009, the way the transit, transshipment, water corridor and everything has been given, has largely been at the exchange of the serious criticism coming from the mass people. So we have to also understand that the shift in the cultural composition of the state is largely different than what we had in 70s, 80s, 90s, and now. And we now have the large population, which is young, and they have a different understanding of strategic autonomy, nationalism, which we now see to a great extent in India too. So I think the youth will also be a fundamental factor in determining Bangladesh's relationship with India, China, and perhaps anybody.
I hope.
Perfect, Dr. Inam. I think with this, we are approaching towards a very important juncture, and it is important to see how China, how are China's footprint in the Southeast Asia. So we have Dr. Rahul Mishra, senior lecturer from the Asia Europe Institute, University of Malaya, Kuala Lumpur, who will be proceeding ahead with his discourse on India's footprint in Southeast Asia and what are the options available for India. Good morning, Dr. Mishra. I think it will be good afternoon in Malaysia.
Yes, it does indeed.
So how are you, sir? And we welcome you to the conclave. We were eagerly waiting to hear you on the topic. The topic is very important because Southeast Asia has the South China Sea also.
Yeah, very good afternoon to you and to all the participants. I'm indeed grateful to the Prestige Institute for this opportunity, particularly Mr. Kamlesh Jain. And I think the tone that has been set by our colleague, co-panelist, gives us a feel that the regional situation, the regional canvas that is there, is largely set by both India and China to varying degrees. And in that context, I think it would be apt to say that what South Asia is to India is for China, Southeast Asia bears a similar sort of resemblance. The difference, however, is that in India's case, in the 90s, starting from the 90s and today, has weakened to a great extent on multiple fronts. Of course, we've got an adversary which was not very interested in putting diplomatic, security, political differences aside and work on economic cooperation. In case of Southeast Asia, almost all countries, I'd say all the countries, including Vietnam, which is a staunch opponent of China, not just in the past few decades, but for centuries, is also very keen to develop an economic cooperation mechanism with them. So Southeast Asian scenario is different for both China and India. And so far as the Chinese footprints in Southeast Asia are concerned, I think rather than just starting, I just flag some milestones as to where China stands and how much China has developed its presence. So I think there are 6 or 7 factors or 6 or 7 milestones which you could see in terms of China's presence in Southeast Asia. The first, of course, is massive investment and trade linkages. And this is not just through bilateral trade mechanisms or agreements, bilateral investments, but also multilateral investment mechanism. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is just the latest one. Unfortunately, or fortunately now in this context of India-China standoff, India walked away from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which is the 10 member countries of ASEAN plus China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. India was earlier there, but not anymore. So that's one multilateral platform. The other one is China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement. So these mechanisms have helped China not only increase its bilateral, multilateral trade arrangements and presence, but also emerge as the biggest trade partner of ASEAN. Today, in the year 2019-20, China has already surpassed European Union as the biggest trade partner of ASEAN, with roughly $300 billion of trade. Now that is one. And like I said before, Southeast Asian countries, for them, historically, because most of these are, except for Cambodia, Laos, and Cambodia and Laos, others have always been very powerful ports, powerful nodes in terms of maritime trade. So for these countries, trade is a priority. Security, of course, is important, but they do not give economy or economic cooperation as they don't put it as the second priority. So in the Southeast Asian context, the biggest factor that has shaped China's presence, China's footprints, is its robust economic presence. The second important point is that China has a very strong diaspora presence. And this diaspora, at least in case of countries such as Malaysia and Singapore, works as a bridge between mainland China, that is the People's Republic of China, and the Southeast Asian countries. So whether you go to Malaysia or to Singapore, you'd see that these ethnic Chinese people are actively involved in promoting relations between China and Malaysia or Singapore. We don't see that happening in case of Indonesia, because Indonesia has historical reasons for it. 1967, when China tried to stage a coup in Indonesia, the Chinese people suffered a lot because the Indonesian government under Suharto thought that the Chinese diaspora was also involved in overthrowing the government and putting in place a communist regime. But that said, the diaspora presence, a diaspora working as the bridge or ambassadors of economic, cultural, people-to-people cooperation is another very important factor. I don't think India's presence, I'll come to India later, India or any other country has that kind of presence or that kind of active network of diaspora. In case of South Asia, we see that diaspora has more or less worked as a liability rather than an asset. And since ethnically also South Asia was at one point a very cohesive unit, that also has put us into this problem of a lot of historical baggage. The third point in terms of China's footprints in Southeast Asia is China, at least for the past 3 decades, has been very active in supporting regimes that are in trouble. Countries that are facing international backlash because of their domestic politics, because of being an authoritarian regime, or they're economically insulated, China has come to their rescue. So in case of Burma, Myanmar, for example, after 8888 incident, when Aung San Suu Kyi was elected and she was overthrown by the military junta, it was China that supported Myanmar. And for a good number of years, China was the only country that was supporting it so strongly. And this went on, I mean, with Than Shwe, with Thein Sein, and even with the current so-called democratic regime that Myanmar has been criticized a lot, especially in Malaysia for their state-supported, if not sponsored, state-supported atrocities against the Rohingya Muslims. So for Southeast Asia, Myanmar is no different. Myanmar under Aung San Suu Kyi and Myanmar as a democratic country is no different from what it was under the military junta. And there again, we see that China is the most important supporter. It's backing the Burmese, the Myanmar economy. It is backing the political system. You go to United Nations Security Council or any other UN Human Rights Council, you see that China has been supporting Myanmar on each and every front. There are other regimes also. Thailand at this moment is not it is not a true democracy at this moment. Prayut Chan-o-cha is, after all, a military leader, a military general who has now become a political leader of sorts. He's also getting a lot of support by the Chinese authorities. Vietnam, of course, is a communist socialist country, and they have party-to-party relations. There again, the Chinese support to Vietnam again shows us that China has this knack of supporting countries that are in trouble, that face problems on normative standards of international community, whether it is the issue of democracy promotion, whether it is the issue of human rights protection, preservation, or atrocities against a minority. So if you go to Cambodia and Laos, you'd see the similar situation. China is the most important country, and that is, you just cannot think of an alternative to China, whether it is India, whether it is the US or European Union. There's just no possibility of replacing China because they have a very tight personal relationship and very tight control over the leaders of these regimes in Southeast Asian countries. At this moment, we see that even in Philippines, Duterte is more or less a fan of Xi Jinping and China. And there again, the reason is that he's waged a war, so-called war, against the drug lords in the Philippines. Thousands of people have been killed and thousands are put behind bars. But anybody who watches Southeast Asia closely would tell you that that's not the reality. He has also included his political opponents, those who do not support his ideology. So basically the rivals, and also the southern Philippines, people who have been demanding more autonomy in the southern Philippines region. So there again, you see that even though it is democratically elected government, Rodrigo Duterte's, the support is coming from China, and there again, it has become a two-way traffic of endorsing each other's policies. Now, countries like India, which are democracies and which have, though India never openly supports or propagates the idea of democracy promotion, unlike the US or European Union countries, but India has this, let's say, a soft corner for democracy, and that is something we've been witnessing in relations with Myanmar, relations with Thailand, of course, even in cases of Pakistan and Afghanistan, Nepal to a certain extent, that whenever there's democracy in trouble, India steps up its presence and tries to make sure that democracy is brought back in the mainstream, in the limelight. So in case of Southeast Asian countries, India finds it really difficult as to how to, make its presence felt to such an extent that these countries are able to choose between India and China, if at all they have to do that. So that is my third point. The fourth is something that we have seen in past 7 years. Southeast Asia has become the cornerstone of China's One Belt, One Road initiative, or the Belt and Road initiative. We know that in 2013, when Chinese Premier Xi Jinping visited Indonesia, he launched the Maritime Silk Road policy, Maritime Silk Road initiative with Indonesia, and Indonesia is one of the weakest links in China's Southeast Asia diplomacy. So he launched this policy, and so far the amount of investment that is done in Southeast Asia exceeds any other region. So if you look at the rail corridor, the port investment in port sector, investment in other areas, The Belt and Road Initiative actually tells us that, of course, except the other side, our good friend Pakistan, CPEC, in addition to CPEC, it's the Southeast Asia Maritime Silk Road, which has gained a lot of attention. Of course, because of both the economic and security regions. For China, the security concern is its Malacca dilemma. It feels that when push comes to shove, if the US-China rivalry keeps on spiraling up and they have tensions, whether it is on the issue of Taiwan or just in South China Sea with Vietnam or any of the allies of the US, let's say Philippines or Japan, then in that scenario, the US would be in a position to choke China's maritime supplies in the South China Sea and on the Malacca Straits. And that has been a major concern for China. And that is why they have been trying to invest a lot in ports, take control. China's attempts to not only invest, we know what China is doing in Sri Lanka. The whole fiasco of Hambantota and also investments in Colombo, in ports like Djibouti, tell us that China is not only interested in port development, port investment, right? They are not just interested in securing maritime supply routes. They're also interested in building military bases. And that is where the key strategic component of Belt and Road Initiative comes in. Southeast Asia, there again, becomes the core of China's policy. Now, so these are the 5 positive, let's say more or less positive points that tell us that China has been a strong player in Southeast Asia. The 6th point is slightly controversial for China, or slightly negative for China, is in terms of its reputation and how Southeast Asian countries perceive it. And that is the ongoing land reclamation and military buildup, or the militarization of islands in the South China Sea. This whole thing started back in 2010, and from 2010 on, we're seeing that China has been building these artificial islands, land reclamation as we call it, and also places like Shansha and several islands and islets in Spratly and Paracel chain of islands. We've seen that China is increasingly working on building airstrips, stationing their military commands, regiments, and also trying to, China has come up with this idea again, and there are rumors that China is going to replicate its model of air defense identification zone, ADIZ, over the South China Sea also. And that's something that China has already done over the East Sea that borders Japan. Now this land reclamation and military buildup has posed security challenges and national security challenges for countries such as Philippines and Vietnam, and they are very concerned about it. On the South China Sea issue, Philippines went to the International Court of Justice, the Permanent Court of Arbitration of ICJ, and they won the case. But China refused to not only participate in the proceedings, but they just said, no, we are not interested. We don't even recognize the UNCLOS, United Nations Convention on Law of Seas. Now, China's side is that they have come up with this imaginary line called the 9-dash line, which was not there in 1940s, not there in 1950s. Forget the 19th, 18th centuries. This is a recent sort of map-based imaginary line that China has come up with, and they have started reiterating, highlighting on this idea of 9-dash line from 1994 onwards. So the first time when they got into this spat with the Philippines. And from that time on, 9-dash line has gradually acquired a central stage in China's South China Sea policy, or China's South China Sea approach. And today we see that they've started calling it a core interest. And for the Chinese Communist Party, core interest, meaning that something that they would really fight very hard for. So in that context, I think South China Sea dispute has become a major challenge for China. Now, where does India stand in all this? I think the first point, which is a very sort of which brings India at par with China, is that both India and China engaged Southeast Asia for more than a millennia. Both of these countries have very strong cultural, social presence in Southeast Asia, and that feature is seen over and again. Like if you just casually visit any of the Southeast Asian countries. Vietnam for India was a bit lesser and more Sinic influence, more Chinese influence. But across the region, 10 countries of Southeast Asia, East Timor, if you want to include, makes it 11, you would see that impact the cultural, social, culinary, linguistic, art and artifacts, architecture. All of this is seen very predominantly, very prominently in terms of presence of both India and China. India has overall a positive image, and it is not considered a threat in Southeast Asia. That is a good part. But at the same time, India is not considered that powerful. And there are several parameters on which we can say that India's presence is not that strong. For instance, in terms of trade and investment, China has got $300 billion of trade, and India's roughly, India's $97 billion, which is roughly $100 billion. And there is balance of the negative balance of trade. So India has to catch up with China on that front quite a lot. Act East policy has been in place since 2014, which is a sort of revised and upgraded version of India's Look East policy, which was launched in 1992. Before that, both India and China during the Cold War years, for structural reasons, India could not engage Southeast Asia to that extent. And China, of course, was considered, being a communist country, was considered an opponent, if not really an enemy. Both India and China started their journey from early 1990s. And we see that in past 30 years, China has covered a lot of ground. And India is really lagging behind in terms of investment, for example. There are problems. But on the normative front, on issues of democracy, on issues of rule of law, respecting international laws of freedom of navigation, protecting international routes or global commons, is something on which India is seen as a role model. India is seen as a natural partner. And also on the South China Sea front, India is seen as a potential defense partner. For instance, countries such as Vietnam have been working with India for roughly from the time of launch of Look East policy, that is 1992. 97, first time we supplied them some equipments on the naval front. But recent developments have also been interesting. For example, India is now helping Indonesia in developing the Sabang port, which is very close to our Andaman and Nicobar Islands. That is a positive sign. Philippines is now showing a lot of interest in defense acquisitions supplies coming from India. So that is, again, a very good possibility. I think more than that, in terms of creating a regional architecture, a liberal, open, inclusive regional architecture, whether it is in the form of Indo-Pacific or just the existing mechanism, the East Asia Summit, which is multilateral, but again, it does not give you a regional order, a regional architecture. As a multilateral, as an institutional partner, India's presence has been something that these countries were really interested in. And it was due to the efforts of countries such as Singapore, Indonesia, and Vietnam that India today is seen as one of the closest partners of the ASEAN region of Southeast Asian countries. There, I think, again, India alone cannot do much because China is militarily very powerful. China is, in terms of investment and economic cooperation, it is powerful. So therefore, the US factor always comes in. And I think to a great extent, that's a good sign. So Indo-Pacific construct, which is, of course, been supported, sponsored by the US and its allies, Japan and Australia, is a good platform. And it's not that Southeast Asian countries are not open to it. It was actually initially when the US administration came up with the idea of Indo-Pacific, they were reluctant because Southeast Asian countries, if you know the history during the Cold War years, they rejected the SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, the initiative launched in 1950s by the US. They completely rejected it. So even in case of Indo-Pacifics, the ASEAN countries were reluctant to join the US. And despite Japan and Australia endorsing the idea, which both these countries have very strong presence in Southeast Asia, despite them supporting this idea, ASEAN was not very keen. And this is something that you can verify. When Prime Minister Modi went to the Shangri-La dialogue and he talked about an open, inclusive, and accommodative, free Indo-Pacific construct, Indo-Pacific order, it struck a right chord with the Southeast Asian countries. And we saw that months later, ASEAN also came up with its own outlook called the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which is very much aligned with India's position that, look, we are not going to go against any country. Indo-Pacific in itself wants to create a regional order that is open to everybody, but at the same time, it respects international laws and rules and norms. So I think in that sense, India is very much a desired partner. It's just that we have to really see as to how India implements its investment promises. How does India keep its promises, particularly on the trade and investment front? And also this thing of sitting on the fence. We keep calling it strategic autonomy and non-alignment and all that. But I think for Southeast Asia and also with the US and its allies, Japan, Australia, South Korea, New Zealand, it is very important that India comes out with a very clear policy, very clear approach on all the issues. And I think quadrilateral dialogue is one such platform. I hope that India would include Australia in the Malabar exercise, and quadrilateral would come up as a viable, as a credible mechanism. I hope that we work on that, because a multi-country regional security role of a multi-country's regional security provider is very important in making sure that South China Sea is not a flashpoint in the region, is not a potential zone of conflict in the region, because the casualty is not just on countries and economies, but also on people, because these are tiny little countries, would be very high. So in case of South China Sea, I think it is very important that we have this regional security provider mechanism. I would conclude by saying what I think roughly 3 decades ago, the Singaporean Prime Minister said, that India and China are like the 2 wings of a virtual aircraft called ASEAN. ASEAN cannot sustain itself, ASEAN cannot fly without either of these. They need both India and China. China more, to my mind, on the economic diaspora fronts, but India on making sure that a regional order, a regional multilateral open inclusive mechanism is in place, and also a country that provides normative aspects to regional status quo, regional strategic equilibrium, and also make sure that China doesn't bully the countries of the region. By providing this viable alternative, I think India would play its role very credibly and very in a very profound manner. That is something that US has also been asking India to do, and Japan increasingly under Shinzo Abe has also been expecting that India would live up to their expectations and play this role of working as a regional stabilizer in the Southeast Asian region, of course, with support of other countries. And that, I think, would help make the regional status quo intact, regional strategic equilibrium intact, and I think China would also be put in its place if all other countries act as the watchdogs. I'll stop there, and if there are any questions, I'll answer. Thank you.
It was an extremely comprehensive discourse on the Southeast Asia, and you categorically covered the South China Sea, which is of very high strategic interest to the world, I must say, because the amount of trade that's moving through the South China Sea, other than the minerals and resources that you have, is there. The Ming Dynasty's 9-dash line is really a big problem, and Chinese keep on referring to it through some maps that they have, which are yet to be verified that how old those maps are, because sometimes they say 9 and sometimes they say 12 dashes. So they keep on altering the status quo of the whole region according to their wish and will. Anyhow, there is a contestation going on in South China Sea, and all the countries which have the borders to the South China Sea are trying to contest maximum amount of land that can happen. Illegal fishing, illegal oil drilling, creation of virtual islands which were not existing earlier are the modern news in the area. Certainly, it's a very important maritime route also, because Indian naval vessels do very frequently pass through the South China Sea, and it sometimes become very difficult that are they in the international waters or are they in the Chinese border, because China keeps on altering the border. So it's very important that we have heard two distinguished people discussing China and our neighbor Bangladesh, and then Dr. Shahab Inam actually went on to discuss the whole region, actually India, China, Bangladesh, and Pakistan to a little extent. I think Dr. Mishra gave us the whole idea of the South China Sea and the Southeast Asian region. In whole of the two discourses and the others that went on from yesterday, there is one point that has come very clearly, that India needs to push a little harder in probably completing the commitments it does in terms of investment. Investment now has become the new tool of aggression. Which also gives us a fair bit of idea that two nuclear nations would not engage in a war, but would engage in trade wars. And it's evidently clear what's happening with the US and China would soon be happening with other countries in the region, and India would be sooner than the others. Under these lines and pretext, I would now like to invite Dr. Ashish Shukla, Research Fellow at the ICWA, New Delhi, and he will be discussing one of the most hottest topics that everybody wants to listen and wants to speak about. And I think we will be trying to decode the recent Sino-India clash in Ladakh. So I invite Dr. Shukla to give his views on the topic.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. First of all, let me thank Department of Law, Prestige Institute of Management and Research, and especially my esteemed friend Kamlesh Jain for inviting me to share my thoughts on the subject with such an august yet virtual gathering. This is my second interaction with the faculty and students of PIMR. I think about 3 years ago in 2016, I had visited Indore and engaged the faculty and students on India-Pakistan relations. Today, as mentioned by Dr. Joshi, I have been asked to talk about Sino-India relationship in the context of the recent clashes in Ladakh. Before I come to the recent development, let me share some personal experience with you. Back in 2019, I was invited by Kunming University for a conference in China. And that was my first and only visit to China so far. Later, I was given a visiting fellowship by a think tank, but I couldn't go due to the emergence of pandemic, as you all know. Anyway, after my return to India last year, my Director General inquired about my visit, and I briefed him in detail whatever has happened at that point of time. He was surprised with the kind of impression and experience which I had in China during my stay. And that's why he was very quick to suggest that I should write a travelogue uh, about whatever happened with me in China. I did that, and it was published by HWA as a special report. The very first paragraph of that travelogue is still very much relevant, and I would like to share a bit about that particular writer. About more than 2 centuries ago, the French statesman Napoleon Bonaparte is believed to have said that China is a sleeping giant. Let her sleep, for when she wakes, she will move the world. Now, fast forward to 2014, President Xi Jinping, while participating in the commemoration ceremony of the 50th anniversary of diplomatic relations with France, he stated that today the lion has woken up, but it is peaceful, pleasant, and civilized. Many of us had reservations about the lion being peaceful, pleasant, and civilized. However, most of us agreed over the fact that China had arrived at the international stage in a big way. Here I mean to say that long before the Doklam and Galwan face-offs, the world was actually discussing about China's rise and assertiveness. There was hardly any important capital in the world where China's rise and its increasing assertiveness as well as muscle flexing was not discussed. Now coming back to Sino-India relationship, one would agree that there has always been a kind of suspicion and uneasiness in Sino-India relations. This suspicion as well as uneasiness came to the fore back in 1947 itself, when India, just before its independence, invited Tibet to participate in Asian Relations Conference, which took place under the auspices of Indian Council of World Affairs, New Delhi, where right now I am working. However, things changed thereafter, and India became one of the few non-socialist countries that officially recognized China and established diplomatic relations in April 1950. Next decade was one of mutual respect and amity, and slogans like Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai echoed equally in both the countries. Chinese Premier Chow En-lai embarked upon a visit to India in 1954, during which there was a joint statement signed, and that joint statement advocated a Panchsheel, the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. Indian Prime Minister later Pandit Nehru reciprocated the visit, and in the same year, and in fact, which was quite, people hailed it as two civilizations strengthening their bonds. The euphoria, however, of this Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai was short-lived, as China betrayed the Panchsheel vision in the wake of a border dispute, which culminated into a limited war in 1962. Chinese, I call it limited because after whatever happened, Chinese withdrew where they had occupied the territory at that point of time. So Chinese described the 1962 as a setback to bilateral relations, whereas India never forgot the deceit, humiliation, and burying of the principle of Panchsheel by China. The improvement in the bilateral relations later were, of course, appreciated by everyone, including the two countries. The two countries in 1980s agreed to resolve the border issues through peaceful and friendly consultations. During Prime Minister Narasimha Raw's China visit in 1993, if I remember correctly, the two sides signed an agreement on the maintenance of peace and tranquility along the line of actual control. In 1996, when Chinese President Jiang Zemin visited India, the two sides agreed to build a constructive partnership and agreed to put confidence building measures in the military field along the line of actual control. From 2014 onwards, if you see the relationship, the two sides actually initiated something called hometown diplomacy under President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and the two leaders visited each other's hometown. They also held two informal summits in Wuhan and Mamallapuram in Chennai to strengthen the partnership. The approach became quite popular as Wuhan spirit, or some call it Wuhan consensus. Despite the looming shadow of 1962, many observers and analysts hailed it as a great approach as a great approach and success. Many thought that the two civilizations were moving in a right direction where tensions would be managed in a way that could not result in any breakdown of relationship. However, that were not to be the case. The recent Chinese incursions in Ladakh have buried the Wuhan consensus in the same way as the events of 1962 had buried the Panchsheel vision. The year 2020 was supposed to be the year of celebration in Sino-India relationship, as it marked the 70th anniversary of diplomatic relations between the two countries. Not long ago, on March 31, 2020, this year itself, Chinese ambassador to India, Mr. Sun Weidong, published a message in the Hindu, the English daily, which, among other things, stated that looking around the world, China and India, as the only two emerging countries with a population of more than 1 billion, shoulder the historical mission of natural regeneration, play a key role in process of the collective rise of developing countries, and inject strong momentum into the profound changes unseen in the century. So that was something he published in his message, and the message further added that at present means by March 2020, at present China-India relations stand at a new starting point and usher in new opportunities. We should draw wisdom from our thousands of years of civilizations and explore a way for neighboring and emerging major countries to get along each other in accordance with enhancing mutual trust, focusing on cooperation, managing differences, and seeking common development. So this was China in March 2020. Did anything change in the next few weeks and People's Liberation Army not only intruded into Indian territory but displayed the barbarism of medieval times? Or was it a strategy to distract Indian policymakers from taking PLA's activities on the ground lightly? It is not quite difficult to make an assessment now about the Chinese intentions, and you all are highly equipped and qualified to analyze what led to the breakdown. Whatever happened in Ladakh has cast a shadow on the Sino-India relationship. Mutual trust and confidence, which took several decades to build, is now at its lowest ebb. And in no circumstances it is going to be restored to the pre-Galawan period. At least not so easily in near future. The Chinese actions were aimed to gain what former Foreign Secretary Nirupama Rao says, tactical advantage and defensive strategic depth against Indian forces in the region. Now the million-dollar question is, why China did this? What was the reason? And it's not quite difficult to answer the question now. The recent clashes appear to be the result of India building up necessary infrastructure in the strategic territory. India was catching up to Chinese buildup at their side of LAC. Slowly but steadily, India built about 5,000 kilometers of road and connected Leh and Daulat Beg Oldi with an all-weather road. This improved India's connectivity in the region, and now India was in a position to move military forces easily in the mountainous region. In Chinese impression, how Chinese minds, think. If you access some of those internal Chinese publications, published in Chinese language, I have read some of the translations of that. I don't know Chinese, so I haven't accessed the first-hand account of that publication. So in Chinese impression, Indian move to consolidate and improve defenses on its side of LAC were considered provocative in that sense. They thought of India as a country making trouble for China in the region. They were already under impression that India was resisting China on BRI, or for that matter CPEC, and siding with the US in containing the rise of China. Let me also highlight that during my visit, when I interacted with so many Chinese there back then, so they all were raising all these issues, and which is now very much at the fore. And then happened Doklam incident back in 2017, and India's move regarding Article 370 and reorganization of Jammu and Kashmir into 2 union territories in 2019 were also seen through this prism. And thus, Chinese wanted to show a firm resistance even at the cost of bilateral relations. Some analysts also believe that amid growing concerns of COVID-19 within the country means within China and beyond, China wanted some sort of distraction. What could have been better than picking up a fight with world's largest democracy? So at home, nationalistic sentiments would trump the post-COVID-19 resentment, and the world will start focusing on lowering the tension between the two Asian giants. So that might have been the strategy. We don't know for sure, but that is one particular angle. Then there are also questions regarding India downplaying the crisis initially, and why is it still in some sort of denial? Answering these questions are not easy, but let me give it a try. If you listen to the ruling dispensation in New Delhi, you would believe that there is a strong resolve to protect the territorial integrity on the one hand, and the disengagement has taken place on the other. And if you see the satellite images, you would realize that the assertion is not completely true. Partially, it is very much true. We would love to defend our territory, but the disengagement is still in process. It's not complete. Besides the Galwan Valley, if you see, Chinese had intruded into several other locations as well, including Pangong Tso Lake and Hot Spring. It is true that Chinese have gone back from the clash site in Galwan Valley, but not before India also agreeing to suspend patrol in the area as it was patrolling earlier. For example, both Indian and Chinese soldiers stepped back at patrolling point 14 in Galwan Valley and patrolling point 15. This is not complete disengagement, as about 50 soldiers on each side are still there in less than 1 kilometer of each other at the patrolling point 17A. Same is not true about other areas where Chinese are still put. At Pangong Tso, Chinese have gone back to Finger 5, but they still occupy the Finger 4 ridge line. They had built substantial infrastructures in the 8-kilometer area between Finger 4 and Finger 8. In Depsang, though there are no clashes as of now, if I'm right, but Chinese side has blocked Indian access to its traditional patrolling area. This is a situation after 4 rounds of Corps Commander level talks. Many analysts also believe that Chinese are deliberately delaying the disengagement process. They are possibly waiting for winters to stretch it too long. Indian side knows this, and that's why if you see the recent newspaper reports, there are reports that India is also preparing for a long haul, and military is very much there, and they are building up. Given the situation on the ground, it can safely be argued that we are far away from status quo ante. Some analysts have also been questioning New Delhi's approach towards the crisis right from the beginning. They are of the view that New Delhi, despite having the ability to put up strong resistance against the Chinese aggression is actually shying away. They accuse New Delhi of ignoring the problem since the very beginning. In late April or in early May, when Chinese started their build-up at their side of LAC. It is not that New Delhi was not aware of these developments. A number of defense analysts, including business standards, Colonel Ajay Shukla, Lieutenant General H.S. Panag, and if I remember, Indian Express Sushant Singh, and most importantly, this Brahmachalani. These guys were cautioning the government through their writings, both in mainstream media as well as social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Some of them regularly appeared in television debates on several mainstream media houses and raised their voices. But as they accuse, New Delhi kept denying on the one hand and did not match the Chinese build-up on the other hand, at least initially when things were happening that point of time. So having said that, now the challenge before India is to restore the status quo ante, and it is not going to easy. How the two countries behave in coming weeks and months is going to be crucial, not only for regional peace and stability, but also for post-COVID-19 world. And I think I'll stop here. And if there are any questions and comments, maybe that can be addressed during the Q&A. Thank you. Thank you once again.
It was a great session from your end, Dr. Shukla. We about a couple of days back had Dr. Harsh Pant also with us, and he had his own opinions on the matter. While you have touched upon the strategic location of the armies of both the countries, he was still of the opinion that it is a resolvable issue, and both countries being nuclear armed countries, the solution will be quiet. And you were a bit critical towards the government, and according to you, they were found sleeping when Chinese started to do the build-up. I personally believe that that should not be the case in modern armed forces strategies, because we have our own satellites and the government might have been seeing it, but there could be a reason at the pace at which the Chinese could have done this, and they have the technology to build things very quickly. So by the time we could have reacted, it was a bit late. Anyhow, since now the session is all open, I invite participants to ask questions through the chat box. And
can I say something before you open it?
Yeah, please.
One point. I didn't mean that India was found sleeping. My only point is that, to my mind, to my understanding, I think we very much knew it. If we had not, known the ground situation, some heads must have been rolled in certain, institutions. That has not happened. So that clears the air that we were not sleeping. But the only thing, what did we do when we realized that they are building up? Actually, to my mind, we were under impression that Wuhan consensus will not be broken up and we will resolve it and things will improve in coming days. That did not happen. That was a miscalculation to my mind. Thank you. Now we can have...
Before we throw it open to the chat box or the questions that come in from various participants, let me kind of summarize what happened in the day today. My name is Dr. Anil Bajpai, as you can probably see on the panel. And a very good morning to Dr. Shukla and to Dr. Mishra. I already wished Dr. Khan a good morning in the morning. It was a very different day today compared to what we witnessed yesterday. Yesterday was a China bashing kind of session. And today was a completely obverse session where there was an attempt in a sort of manner to kind of give some balm of solace to the already beleaguered and battered Chinese people and government and Xi Jinping for the activities that have been going on since October last or November last. While the balance is wonderful, and I welcome what Dr. Khan said about Bangladesh trying to so delicately balance the trade and other activities between India and China, where Bangladesh is kind of a mediator. They were talking about, he spoke a lot about the refugee problem, which kind of rang several bells. I will not talk to in the panel over here. We will discuss with him separately. 1 million refugees from Burma or Myanmar coming into Bangladesh, creating an issue of sorts. India has faced such things before. That's all I would say right now. Then Mishraji took a very, very, what should I say, succinct and all-round view of the South China Sea, the trade, the Navy, whatever else there is. And then, of course, Dr. Shukla was very, very clear and very strong in his thoughts and a fresh view about the balance between what the newspapers and the media has been talking about. One section of the media keeps blaming the government, and the other section of the media keeps blaming China. I'm not sure how many of you have been there, but fortunately, I have been to those areas, and I have been going there to those areas because of certain family connections for the last many, many years. And believe me, China versus Pakistan are two different stories. While with Pakistan, we've had armed conflicts continuously on the Kashmir border for God knows all along. Every day there is shelling. It ends up in some villages being part of casualty. But with the Chinese, we have had unarmed combat all this while. There has been skirmishes of people wrestling with each other, but not a shot has been fired, whether it was Doklam or it was Galwan. Galwan, of course, resulted in casualties, again, without a bullet being fired. What I want to say is that these kind of things have been going on the Pangong Tso Lake, not from today, but been going on forever. 2/3 of the lake belongs to China, 1/3 of it belongs to India. And both of them want more and more share. So it's not as if China is the only aggressor. We also are equally belligerent at times. So let's face facts. And I would say I was pleasantly surprised at the balanced view and a departure from the China bashing that we normally hear. So great session in the day, and I would now ask Dr. Nishant to open up for questions from all of us.
So I think we have Nakul.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
You can start the question and answer session. I think the first question of the day was raised by Sejal Chablani to Dr. Mishra. And she says, I'll start the first question and then Nakul will take it over. That nearly 200 billion of India's trade passes through the South China Sea. Also, we know that Indo-Pacific has prospered under American hegemony. For the previous 40 years, USA invested around $300 billion in ASEAN in 2017. Being Quad member, India has strong relations and common goals with US in this regard. Please tell how India can use this to make strong impact in the ASEAN and South China Sea, unlike today when India has become just a witness to China's dominance. in South China Sea and China's 9-line fake commitments. So, Sejal, before Dr. Mishra actually starts off replying to your answer, this 9-Ming Dynasty line is yet to be declared fake. So we need to wait for historians to come down and tell that the map is a fake map. Anyhow, Dr. Mishra, please carry on with it.
Well, the first thing is that, of course, the US is a resident superpower in ASEAN and Southeast Asian countries rely a lot. Countries such as Singapore, increasingly Vietnam, they rely a lot on the American support. For India, there are two issues. I mean, it's really a big dilemma. One is that in terms of your military strategic capabilities, how far can you go in South China Sea? You need to have access. First, you need to have like real-time military access. That means access to ports where you can strategically, militarily operate. That is number one. India is trying to do that. I mean, Da Nang port is in Vietnam, and officially India has access to that. But that is only for extreme situations, under extreme circumstances. The second, Subang port, India is working on that. Maybe at one point in time, we'll get a military sort of access. Singapore is a great military supporter and partner of India. So there again, we have access. But how to convert that into something on the military front is something that we have to really take a call. And do we really need to get into a fight with China on South China Sea? Is again a question that you have to really ponder over, because Southeast Asian countries, they don't want to fight with China. That is very clear. They want a sort of soft balancing. They do not want a military escalation, and they've been saying it for long. Even to the US, they've been saying that, look, we want your support. We want India. We want the US, Australia, Japan, but we do not want so that China remains in its place. That is it. We do not want to choose between US and China, and we certainly do not want to escalate these disputes into a military conflict. So I think for India, at this moment, the issue is to build capacities, to go deeper in strategic and military cooperation with the region. And I think that would start with greater cooperation with select countries. India is already doing that, but trilateral mechanism or quadrilateral mechanism that India has been working on. Quadrilateral is something that we've talked so much about. I mean, thousands of articles have been published in Indian newspapers, but the ground reality is that we still have to conduct the second military exercise. So as Indians, not my personal favorite, but I would just use this idea of Amartya Sen, that we are just argumentative Indians. We talk a lot, we discuss a lot, but when it comes to doing things on the ground, we still lag on those fronts. So that, I think, would answer the question. But before I pass on the virtual mic to Dr. Joshi, I would just chip in for a minute in support of Dr. Shukla, because I understood it correctly that he did not mean to say that India or Indian policymakers were caught sleeping. Somebody who has, he and I have a lot of similarities. Somebody who's worked in IDSA, which is a military, which is a Ministry of Defense think tank, wouldn't say that, because on the ground, I don't know if you've spoken to our former colleagues from the armed forces, including, I didn't talk to him, but of course, the person who's dealing with these negotiations, Major General Harinder Singh, the Corps Commander of the Fire and Fury. These are people who have a very solid understanding of the topography. And these are people who've, like, having worked under his direct support, I mean, he was my immediate boss. I can vouch that these are kind of people who would not even let an inch go out of our hands. And this is based on personal experience, the kind of integrity these people have, the kind of very fiery belly they have when it comes to India's territorial integrity, is something that that would tell you that in media, which is, I mean, in media, you see contradictory reports, you hear contradictory, contrasting voices, which is the beauty of a democracy. I mean, if you just do a role reversal, Congress in power and BJP in opposition, you'd hear similar things from BJP. That's the beauty of a democracy, because these are things that keep on telling you that, look, the government can do more. So it's a kind of pushing the government to do better. And I think to that extent, it's good. Of course, it has, in the age of social media, it has gone a little vicious. But I mean, that side apart, opposition is playing its role, and it is actually encouraging, even though slightly negatively encouraging government to really stand up to the Chinese aggression and Chinese policies. Dr. Joshi.
Very well, sir. We understood and appreciate your views. And there is a question by Anirban Datta, and this question comes to Dr. Shukla. What is the relevance of Shanghai Cooperation Organization BRICS in the context of Indo-China conflict?
Okay, first there is a correction. When you refer to Indo-China, it's not India-China. Dr. Mishra will be very happy to clarify what does that mean. Always refer, either you say India-China relationship or you say Sino-India relationship. Don't say Indo-China. It's not Indo-Pak. You can say Indo-Pak, you can't say Indo-China. Indo-China is a very different reason, which does not involve India. Anyway, so I mean, what is the relevance of SCO and BRICS? If I heard correctly,
Yeah.
or only SCO?
Yeah. What's the relevance of the SCO
okay.
and BRICS?
It's up to Indian policy. Okay, it's up to Indian policy makers to draw a conclusion. You know, SCO, you can say that China is a dominant one, but if you see BRICS, there are other powers as well. So, do you really want to isolate any groupings which includes China? If yes, then go ahead. And if you can't afford to isolate yourself from every other grouping where China is involved, as I said right in the beginning, that hardly there is any international capital where China's rise are not being discussed. So everybody is engaging China, though Chinese have certain issues, certain image issues. Like you are not seen as an aggressor, Chinese are being seen as an aggressor. Be it South China Sea or recently whatever has happened, it has been a dent on their image as well. So you have to be very cautious. Our policymakers have not given any indication that we are going to do anything like that. So we have to wait, and we have to be very cautious in approaching our in approaching the COVID-19 world, which is going to be very different. It's not going to be the same world. So we have to be very careful when framing our policies in that particular context.
I perfectly agree. The multilaterals were basically made after the problem that took place during the World War II, where the world was not speaking to each other. So these are forums where you can actually come and a dialogue can take place. And I think these forums sometimes play a crucial role in reinstating the balance around the world. Dr. Shukla, we have one more question coming to you from Dr. Praveen Chand Singh from Delhi. He asks that you have visited China and talked with several Chinese. Then what you observed about the Chinese people? Are they really happy with their communist government and its policies with India? And he links another question, and he asks, what is your observation about the societies, specifically the communist rule? One was the USSR and the second is the Chinese communist idea. Which communist rule was obligates more closer to humanity?
See, you cannot compare China with India. The two societies and two, states are very different. When I visited China, I had interacted with a number of Chinese people, but these interactions were limited. I was not freely interacting with everyone. Remember, when you are visiting China, you go to the places where they want you to go. You cannot go and you cannot talk to everyone. Let me give you an example. We were visiting a tourist spot close to Kunming, about 100 kilometers or something. And there was this ropeway where we were supposed to be going. We were also supposed to use the ropeway, and there were a long queue, and a lot of young students were there. Young students, when I say, I mean below I think 10th or 12th standard students. So I thought of striking a conversation with some of them, but they were hesitant to talk to you. Reason, I mean, I could think of, that there might be two reasons. One, they are trained in a way that they need not to interact with foreigners, because the system is like that. If you interact with a foreigner, maybe you can give some clue to something which is not liked by the state itself. And then the other might be the case of language, because I was speaking in English. Maybe there was an issue with them. So you cannot compare the two societies are very, very different, and there is no way. I mean, you can also, you cannot gauge whether Chinese were happy with the Chinese state communist rule, because one thing was sure: there was no criticism of President Xi Jinping, no criticism. Even my host and some other people even told me that even you cannot create jokes on President Xi Jinping. If you create jokes on President Xi Jinping, like we create jokes in our country on every other leader, including Prime Minister Narendra Modi, so you might end up in jail, or you might end up in something else, in some other world. So that is pretty much sure. And one more thing is there, that Chinese president is quite popular in that sense. I mean, what I could gauge, I cannot say it for sure, because my interactions were limited. Popular in the sense that whatever Chinese president says, people take that seriously. Like what Prime Minister Modi says, people in India take that seriously. And one example I would like to give, my host told me that back in 2014 or 15, President Xi Jinping visited the area where I was visiting, and he told his people that, look, green mountains and clean waters are your gold and silvers. So you have to preserve them. And after 5 years, when I was visiting in the area, I could see that they were very much acting like that. And let me also tell you, I visited Arkhai Lake, and Arkhai Lake was so clean. I can't imagine any other river in India being that clean. Reason, they don't allow people to freely go there and do whatever we do here in our country. And I also spotted a board which somewhat resembled, like, there was this board the board read that we have to protect Mother Arkhai Lake as our eyes. So that says that we also refer to rivers in India as mothers, be it Ganga, Yamuna, or others. But see what we have done to that. So these are the things which we should also consider when comparing the two societies. And the other one is the ideological question: which rule is closer to humanity? It's really difficult to say. I'm not a philosopher, so I cannot answer that question too directly. Maybe my friend Dr. Mishra have some views on that.
Anyhow, communist rules world over have similar problems and challenges, and they have their own Tiananmen Square incidences, be it Russia or be it China. Anyhow, there's a lot of things to be learned from China. Yesterday, we had Dr. Jain, who was referring to the discipline and work culture of China. Then we had Dr. Mohit Nayal, who was referring to the central principle of development of people in China, which makes the leader very popular. And we had Dr. Harsh, who was saying that there is a growing resentment amongst people, specifically the Eastern China, where development has not taken place much. People are feeling the heat, and there is a growing resentment, and the Chinese Communist Party is feeling the heat, and that's the reason they are trying these expansionist policies to divert the thought process of their own people. And communism has its own fair share. We can't say which devil is better. Devil is a devil, end of the day. Anyhow, to sum up the event, we are left with the last session of Dr. Anil Bajpai. So I'll invite Dr. Bajpai to actually give his session, which would be the concluding session also. So do we have Sir with us? Kamlesh, can you just check if Sir
Thank
is...
you. Thank you.
All right, fine.
Thank you, Nishant. After such stalwarts have given their views, it is for me like showing a lamp to the sun. We've had such brilliant discourses over the last 2 days, and some of the most enlightening activity. If somebody was to write a book about the entire proceedings of the sessions the conclave has seen, I am sure we will be having a storehouse of great knowledge about this I will correct myself, not Indo-Chinese, but the Sino-Indian relationships in the past, in the present, and what we can look for the future. Having said that, I must share my 2 bits on what the situation is unfolding like. What Dr. Mishra said was so much close to my heart, in terms of having talked to or talked for Lieutenant General Harinder Singh. This is exactly the situation. None of us have been there. None of us have seen it. And you will see channel after channel on the television talking as if they are present on finger 5 of Galwan Valley. I mean, what on earth? People talk as if they are, it's right there. संस्कृत में याद आती है गीता का पहला जो शब्द है कि संजय उवाच, हमें दिख रहा है वहां पे क्या हो रहा है. अरे कमाल हो गया भाई. Believe what the government says, believe what the general says, believe what the army soldiers say. Believe them. Don't believe media. Don't believe us. Believe those people who lay down their lives for protecting all of us. It is that kind of a thing which I kind of feel so hassled about. And Rahulji has actually, stirred me awake and triggered that little part of me. I have my own nephew who is a major in the Gorkhas. And you can imagine what Gorkhas do and how Gorkhas behave. And he was 65 meters from the adversary in the Poonch area. And he was there for about 6 months. Actually 3 years, but 6 months was the shelling part. And in 6 months, they were being shelled on a daily basis, and they were returning fire. Now, this is not something the media will ever understand or know. So let's believe it from the soldiers who are there. Let's believe it from them what they are doing. Coming back to the trade war that's going on, something that Dr. Khan had so beautifully mentioned about how much dependence there is. What are the Chinese methods of expanding their commercial wisdom and acumen across the globe, building roads from China to Burma, from China to Pakistan, and ensuring that these routes, or so to say the modern Silk Route and thereafter, will create opportunities of huge trade. They will create opportunities of great business, investments. But yesterday's discussions bring back those memories of how China in the last 100 years has grown or expanded. China has two kinds of processes. One process is acquiring territory and creating territorial gains, whether it is Tibet. India and China, by the way, had no border with each other in 1947. India was not at all a border country to China. And today, we have what? More than a 3,000 kilometer or 2,000 kilometer border with China. And that's because Tibet is now China. A lot of Russia has been accessed. Mongolia, the southern part, completely accessed. Lots of island nations accessed. Taiwan was one of those people who broke away. Now, Hong Kong is the latest accession. 1997, they took it back from the British, and now it's China. Look at all this. What's this pointing towards? This is pointing towards creating one huge China, which is all over the place. But please realize, they stopped this somewhere. They stopped it at some point in time, after which they began consolidating and creating the economic supremacy. And now, whether it is Sri Lanka, or it is Tanzania, or it is Kenya, or it is Zambia, or it is any other developing country nation, they go there, they participate in tenders to build railways, to build roadways, to build bridges, and to provide absolute low-cost labor and low-cost technology. And what do? They even provide loans. At the end of it, they have actually helped that country grow, but at the cost of its economic independence. And many countries across the world are falling prey to this Chinese method of accession economically. What is it pointing towards? If I have territorial power over the world, if I have economic power over the world, it is nothing but challenging the might of the United States, who actually was their benefactor to begin with, when in 1978 they were declared the most favored nation. And I don't recall who the president was, but President Nixon had actually opened the dialogue with Mao Zedong to start the so-called trade process. So 1962, something that Indians will never forget, and that is something which Dr. Shukla also mentioned. Indians will never forget. We will never forget that Nehruji made a mistake. We will never forget that a railroad was being built right up to the McMahon line, and somehow we ignored it. We let the Chinese come very close to us, and we let them become aggressors, and we lost a lot of our people, we lost a lot of our territory, and we in fact gave up a lot of our territory. It is sad but true. Now, having seen that happening, am I audible? Because somewhere I seem to have lost the Zoom.
No, sir, you're perfectly audible.
All right, thank you so much. So, having said this, now let me come back to the future. The pandemic called COVID-19. There are theories around it. Is it really a virus? Is it a man-made virus? Is it a virus that came out of a biological warfare laboratory? Or is it a natural mutant virus that keeps coming back and back after every 100 years? We don't know for sure. We don't know the origin. We don't know the vaccine. We don't know how long it is going to last. We don't know very much about it, in spite of the fact that we are in the 21st century. But we do know one thing. We do know one thing. Had it not been for the media, had it not been for the internet, had it not been for the information flow that is happening so rapidly, we would be sitting pretty. I mean, what have we lost in the last 6 months? Look at a country like India. 26,000 people died in 5 months. Is that alarming? Is that normal? Is that something that even common cold takes a toll of? I'm not sure. But I just want to say that had it not been for this meeting. So is this a media hype? Is this a proxy war we don't understand at all? I mean, these are questions which I would like people to ponder upon and take it forward and see how can we build upon this, and actually maybe some few years down the road somebody will be writing a book in the history annals and say that we've got uh, so many people who will be talking about the China developed Wuhan created virus called COVID-19, which was no more than a myth. I hope it is like that. I just hope it is like that. I hope it disappears in a little while. I hope we see those Nostradamuses of the world coming true. We see those people who have been, we hope that those people who've been saying that in the couple of years, couple of months, the coronavirus will completely disappear from the face of this earth. I just hope that happens. The discussion that we are happening right now, is it related to all this? Is it related to the coronavirus? Is the Chinese accession theory something new that happened 5 months ago or 6 months ago? Is the trade activity that China developed happened in 5 months, or did it happen in the last 35 years? Did the GDP of China grow rapidly in the 5 months preceding, or in the last 35 years that it took place? This is the one of the issues that we must all look towards, consider, and see how is it possible that a nation which has followed a certain process for the last 75 years suddenly becomes a rogue nation. Suddenly everybody is shouting against him. Suddenly, why all this is happening? I'm sure we will find the answers. They're not easy to come by. But my little suggestion is that we must look for answers in the media, in the flow of information, in the ability for us to communicate so much faster, and in the ability of us to analyze things so much better than before. Uh, I do not want to take more time because I will be then repeating what has already been conveyed so succinctly and so beautifully by the three learned speakers before me. And so Nakul, I would want you to now take over and go on with the session as it pertains.
Thank you so much, sir. Uh, Before I move on to another question that has been asked by a participant, I would also like to second your thought, Bajpai sir, that we need to believe the media. We don't need to believe the media, but we should back our armies. We need to back our politicians, the people who are at the helm of the affairs, and people who are on the ground facing such harsh realities. But the sad reality is that we as Indians, we need to stand united, and which is not the case right now. I would also like to mention one particular instance that I've read during the rule of Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was not a very popular leader in the West, but within his country, he had a certain amount of popularity. And I've read this one instance. I don't know uh, how much truth is involved while reciting this instance, but during the Great Famine in China in 1960s, Mao Zedong was being blamed by the Western forces that it's because of his policies that China is not able to recover from the famine that it has been facing. And at that point, Mao Zedong told his people in China that it is the birds that are eating the rice. And at that point, Mao Zedong ordered all the people in China or requested them to shoot the birds. And you will not believe that in those days, farmers, they did not have guns, they threw stones at birds because they had complete faith in their leader. It's not, I'm not saying to be blind towards our faith, towards our leader, but at a time like this, when, we are facing external aggression, this is a time where we need to stand united. So I need to move further. There is another question that has been directed to Dr. Ashish Shukla, and this will be a last question. Uh, the question has been again asked by Anirban. Anirban is one of our active listeners, and he's from Calcutta. So the question he poses is that how China's wolf warrior diplomacy is opposed to the diplomacy pursued by the China's political forefathers.
You know, every other leader has a different set of priorities. So of course things are going to be different what they were not earlier. As far as this wolf warrior diplomacy is concerned, I have a problem with this terminology, because the way Chinese define wolf warrior diplomacy is not the way they practice. They define the wolf warrior diplomacy like that they will never bully any country, they will never pick up a fight, but they will always push back if there is an aggression, or if there is something which hurts China. So see what they did in Ladakh. Was it a wolf warrior diplomacy? Of course not. They pick up a fight deliberately. They picked up a fight. We were not there to provoke them. We were just building infrastructure in our area, and it was not a new infrastructure which was being developed. We were developing it for several years, several years. But that has come to some sort of conclusion that when we completed the road which connected Leh and Daulat Begordi, they realized that now India can move the military equipment and military forces easily. I mean, in comparison to earlier years. And then they realized that if India has that kind of capacity in this particular region, then it might pick up a fight. As there was some indication of it when Home Minister Amit Shah was speaking in the parliament, and he said that we will not only eyeing to recover POK, but we are also thinking of Aksai Chin. He said something like that. I don't remember the exact words. So these are the things. So Chinese realized that after 370, whatever changes we did in 370, and whatever changes we did to the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir, they realized that since we are building up infrastructure in this particular area, and this might go against your interest. So that interest is very different thing. What is not in your interest does not mean that it is right, or it is wrong in that sense. So to protect their interest, they say they did it, but if we see it from our point of view, they entered into our territory and stopped us. So they picked up a fight, not we. We only responded. And whatever happened, you all know that 20 of our people lost their lives. A significant number of Chinese also lost their lives, but we don't know because the two systems are very different. We don't know officially because they don't confirm how many of their soldiers got killed or injured. So this is the difference between two systems. And as long as your question is concerned, I would again say that look, what Napoleon Bonaparte had said, that China is sleeping, but certainly it may wake up. When it will wake up, it will move the world. That you can take in a positive way, or you can take it in a negative way. So what Chinese are doing right now against what Chinese President Xi Jinping said, that land is peaceful and pleasant and civilized. Do you think China is a peaceful, pleasant and civilized land? Of course not. They are very aggressive. And their aggression is very well recorded. They don't consider any norm. They don't consider any, even they are ready to violate any treaty. They are ready to violate any treaty. See the kind of agreements we have with China over border. And they buried it in one go. They buried it in 2020. The agreements in 1993, 1996 and onwards, there were various CBMs. Did they follow anything? No. So once the situation changed, like they realized that they are powerful enough to dictate terms, so they are picking up fights deliberately. So that is my submission to you.
Thank you so much, sir, for answering the question. I hope, Anirban, this solves your doubt. Uh, uh, I would now move towards the vote of thanks, and I would request our department in charge, if it's possible for him to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of the department. Dr. Nishan Joshi.
Thank you, Nakul. It was 2 days of extremely stimulating sessions of two different poles, I must say. As Dr. Vajpayee told, and I will second him, that on the first day, we had charged up speakers who had battered China left, right, and center. Today, we had a much balanced diaspora, and our panelists came out with both equaling points on both ends. In these 2 days, there were certain points which were very common. One of the most important parts, probably, which we must learn out of this conclave of 2 days, is that India must honor investment commitments. There is simply no other way. There is no diplomatic way to engage countries, keep them attached to your interests till we can go ahead and honor our investment commitments on time. There are cases where we even delay our investment commitments and we get into trouble. Chabar is a living example of the same. While we continuously contest on the fact that the US sanctions and earlier the UN sanctions were the root cause of this problem. But I must be honest that we have extremely delayed our investment commitment. This is the case of Sri Lanka. This is the case of Bangladesh. I must say that all said and done, the Chinese way cannot be appreciated. They have their own ways of dealing with things, and they are aggressive in occupying lands, and probably in the center of their dream is a successful USSR model in the Chinese way. And I think this reality that they think is possible might not be so possible in a world which is still largely dominated by democratic powers. And democracy is something which is relished and revered by all in the world. So considering these things and acknowledging the efforts our panelists have made, both in terms of the time they have spent with us and the knowledge they have shared with our participants, I thank all of them from the bottom of my heart. I also thank the organizing committee, which has really curated these wonderful sessions. I'm also of the I also say thanks to all the participants who are there for these 2 days. And I think our panelists have done justice to our expectations. Thank you all. Thank you, Nakul. Thank you, Vajpayee sir, for sparing all those 2 days in your extremely busy schedule. And summing up session was great.
Thank you, sir. Now we'll conclude the session, and the certificates will be provided to the participants very soon. Please stay active on the WhatsApp groups. Thank you so much for being here with us. I'll be ending the meeting now. Thank you to all the panelists also.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.